Hi, I'm back with chapter 32. A few days later, Cody sat out on her newly renovated garden furniture in her back garden, sipped on a glass of red wine, and listened to the sound of wind chimes making music in the breeze. She looked around at the neat lines of her newly landscaped garden and decided that whosoever was working on it had to be a professional. She breathed, she breathed in and allowed the sweet scent of flowers to fill her nostrils. It was 8 o'clock, and already it was beginning to get dark. The bright evenings were gone, and everybody was once again preparing for hibernation. She thought about the message she had received on her answering machine that day. It had been from the recruitment agency, and she'd been shocked to receive a reply from them so quickly. The woman on the phone said that there had been a great response to her resume, and already Holly had two job interviews lined up. Butterflies fluttered around her stomach at the thought of them. She had never been particularly good at interviews. But then again, she had never been particularly keen on any of the jobs she had she was being interviewed for. This time she felt different. She was excited to get back to work and to try something new. Her first interview was for a job selling advertising space for a magazine that circulated throughout Dublin. It was something she had absolutely no experience in, but was willing to learn because the idea of it sounded far more interesting than any of her former jobs, which had mostly entailed answering the phone, taking messages, and filing. Anything that involved not having to do any of those things all day was a step up. The second interview was with a leading Irish advertising company, and she knew she had absolutely no hope of getting it, but Jerry had told her to shoot for the moon. Polly also thought about the phone call she had just received from Denise. Denise had been so excited on the phone, she didn't seem to be bothered at all by the fact Polly hadn't talked to her since they went out for dinner. In fact, Polly didn't think she even noticed. Denise had been all talk about her wedding arrangements and rambled on almost an hour about what kind of dresses she should wear, which flowers she should choose, where she should hold the reception. She started sentences and then forgot to finish them as she jumped from topic to topic. Holly had to do all Holly had to do was make a few noises to let her know she was still listening, although she wasn't. The only piece of information she had taken in was that Denise was planning to marry on New Year's Eve, and by the sound of it, Tom wouldn't be having a say in how Denise's special day should be run. Polly was surprised to hear that she had set a date so soon. She had just assumed it would be one of those long winded, last a few years kind of engagements, especially as Denise and Tom had only been an item for 5 months. But Polly didn't worry about that as much as would have done when she was at her old self. She was now a regular subscriber to Finding Love and Holding On to It Forever magazine. Denise and Tom were right not to waste time worrying about what people thought if they knew in their hearts it was the right decision. Sharon hadn't called Holly since the day after, as she announced her pregnancy, and Holly knew she would have to call her friend soon before the days passed her by and it was too late. This was an important time in Sharon's life, and she knew she should be there for her. But she just couldn't bring herself to. She was being jealous, bitter, and incredibly selfish. She knew that, but Holly needed to be selfish these days in order to survive. She was still trying to get her head round the fact that Sharon and John were managing to achieve everything that everyone had always assumed Holly and Jerry would do first. Sharon had always said she hated kids, Holly thought angrily. It began to get chilly, and Holly took her glasses of wine inside to her warm house where she refilled it. All she could do for the next couple of days was attend her job interviews and pray for success. She went into the sitting room, put her and Jerry's favorite album of love songs on the CD player, and snuggled up on the couch with her glass of wine, where she closed her eyes and pictured them dancing around the room together. The following day, she was awoken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She got out of bed and threw Jerry's dressing gown on, presuming it was her car being returned from the garage, where she'd left it for its annual service. She peeped out of the curtains and immediately jumped back as she saw Richard stepping out of his car. She hoped he hadn't seen her because she really wasn't in the mood for one of his visits. She paced the bedroom floor, feeling guilty as she ignored the doorbell ringing for the second time. She knew she was being horrible, but she just couldn't bear sitting down with him for another awkward conversation. She really hadn't anything to talk about anymore. Nothing had changed in her life. She had no exciting news, not even any normal news to tell anybody, never mind Richard. She breathed a sigh of relief as she heard him walk away, and then his car door banged shut. She stepped into the shower and allowed the warm water to run over her face, and she was once again lost in a world of her own. 20 minutes later, she padded downstairs in her Disco Diva slippers. A scraping noise from the outside made her freeze in her step. She pricked her ears as she listened more closely, trying to identify the sound. There it was again, a scraping noise and a rustling, as if somebody were in her garden. Holly's eyes widened as she realized that her leprechaun was outside. She crept into the living room, stupidly thinking the person outside would hear her wandering around her house, and got down on her knees, peering above the windowsill. She gasped as she saw Richard's car still sitting in the driveway. What was even more surprising was the sight of Richard on his hands and knees with a small gardening implement in his hand, digging up the soil and planting new flowers. She crawled away from the window and sat on the carpet in shock, unsure what to do next. The sound of a car being parked outside the house snapped her back to the attention, and her brain went into overdrive as she tried to figure out whether to answer the door to her mechanic or not. For some reason, Richard didn't want Holly to know that he was working on her garden, and she decided she was going to respect that wish for now. She hid behind the couch as she saw the mechanic approach the door, and she had to laugh at how ridiculous all this seemed. The doorbell rang, and she scurried even further into the couch as the mechanic walked over to the window and stared in. Her heart beat wildly, and she felt as though she were doing something illegal. She covered her mouth and tried to smother her laughs. She felt like a child again. She had always been hopeless at playing hide and seek. Whenever she felt her seeker coming near her, she would always get an attack of the giggles and her hiding place would be found. Then, for the rest of the day, she would have to search everybody else. She breathed a sigh of relief as she heard the mechanic drop the keys through the letterbox and walk away. A few minutes later, she stuck her head out from behind the couch and checked if it was safe to come out. She stood up and brushed the dust off her clothes, telling herself she was too old to be playing silly games. She peeked out from behind the curtains again and saw Richard packing up his gardening equipment. Polly kicked off her slippers and shoved her feet into her trainers. On second thought, these silly games were fun, and she had nothing else to do. As soon as she saw Richard drive down the road, she ran outside and hopped into her car. She was going to follow her leprechaun. She managed to stay 3 cars behind him all the way, just like they did in the movies, and she slowed down as she saw him pulling over ahead of her. He parked his car and went into the news agent and returned with a newspaper in his hand. Polly put her sunglasses on and adjusted baseball cap, and peered over the top of the Arab leader that was covering her face. She laughed at herself as she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked like the most suspicious person in the world. She, she watched Richard cross the road and head into the greasy spoon. She was slightly disappointed. She was hoping for a far juicier adventure than this. She sat in her car for a few minutes trying to formulate a new plan and jumped with fright when a traffic warden banged on her window. You can't park here, he said, motioning towards the car park. Holly smiled back sweetly and rolled her eyes as she backed into a free space. Surely Cagney and Lacey never had this problem. Eventually, her inner child settled down to have a nap, and mature Holly took her cap and glasses off as she tossed them onto the passenger seat, feeling foolish. Silly games over. Real life starting now. She crossed the road and looked around inside the cafe for her brother. She spotted him sitting down with his back to her, hunched over his newspaper and drinking a cup of tea. She marched over happily with a smile on her face. God, Richard, do you ever go to work? She joked loudly, causing him to jump. She was about to say more, but stopped herself as he looked up at her with tears in her eyes. His shoulders began to shake. Now that's the end of chapter 32. Meet you at chapter 33.